Hi, I'm Lynn Fishman, and I'm coming to you from the 40th Annual International Conference on Wellness and Consciousness Studies here in Montreal, Quebec. This conference is sponsored by the International Institute of Integral Human Sciences. This is the place to be to get inspired with practical tools to live your best life. I'm really pleased to have one of our most popular speakers here, and this is Adhi, Two Owls. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Adhi, although I don't think everything I say gives you justice, because she has so many wonderful qualities. So Adhi is a trained shaman and healer. She's a painter and sculptor, a student of earth and natural sciences, astronomy, physics, Tibetan Buddhism, Western spiritual practices, Qigong, Chinese medicine, sacred geometry, dowsing, meditation, and she is also the president of the American Society of Dowsers. Adhi has spent the last 20 years studying the function and use of sacred objects as they are found all over the world. And we're going to have a little taste of the beautiful work that Adhi does as she has brought some of these sacred objects with her. Adhi also facilitates public and private sessions on a number of creative and spiritual topics. Adhi, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you, Lynn, for asking me.
So, I polled our online audience who has a number of questions for you.
Okay.
So maybe we could go through the questions and then we could talk about the beautiful things that you brought.
Absolutely, that sounds like a great idea.
Okay, so the first question goes like this. Becoming a shaman is not just about learning techniques, but it's about becoming.
Well, there's a lot of truth in that. I think any spiritual path, but particularly shamanism, is a lifestyle. You make a choice to serve, and that's ultimately what a shaman does. Is they serve between all the worlds. So we're sort of like the person that goes in between. So, and the worlds change and shift. So one of the things you can think about is there's two spheres, one inside the other, and there's a space in between. And the center space could be, let's say, earth-centric. So it could be all the natural sciences and things like that. And the outer sphere could be gods, goddesses, divine, spiritual essence, right? And those two constantly shift back and forth. So our focus as societies go back and forth. But the shaman isn't pulled into either one. They live in that space in between. So regardless of what is centric or not, the shaman is the one who sort of sews the two worlds together.
How interesting. So very focused and centered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Very focused and centered. Yes. I love that. And I imagine also it requires a good flexibility because you're resting on solid. You have to be stable, resting on solid ground, and yet tuned into these different energies.
Yes, all of the training is about living in multiple worlds at the same time. So like when you practice, you're practicing accessing through the theta state different dimensions, different realities, and bringing that information in. So you have to have one foot in this reality because this is just as valuable as all the other ones. So yes.
I love it. Okay, let's go with our next question. Our audience asks, how can I find a shaman if I'm looking for one in my city, my area?
Yeah.
How do we go about finding it?
Yeah, we're not in the yellow pages.
Right.
We're in Google searches, so that can be a little
iffy.
Yeah, a little iffy. I always tell people, use your best curious self and ask questions. There are a lot of people out there that call themselves shamans.
Okay.
And there are a lot of people that do healing of various types. But even shamans, things to ask questions and ask like, who do they study with, and where's their lineage, and are they still in contact with their teachers? Do they still have mentors? Things like that. Because we're not we're sort of free spirits, but we're also, really connected to the, I don't want to use the word hierarchy, but there's a way in which we're all sort of connected in a way that we monitor each other and things like that. So, and shamanism is also, it's a little, how would I describe it? When you become a shaman, you, like I said, you make the choice to serve. And if we had a real contract, we would say we would have something, you do whatever you do by any means necessary. Okay, so like that's where the trickster thing comes in, and that's where, but you do the next right thing. You bring people to where they need to go. You need to bring people back into balance. And it's not an ego thing. You do it because it's the next right thing in the world. So that's what you always have to look is how does the shaman serve the community? How are they functioning in the community? So it's not about hanging a shingle and saying,
right.
I heal people. It's watching their actions and how they serve.
And different communities might need different things.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's bringing people together for fire circles and doing that kind of energy, and sometimes it's doing straight up mediation because the community is at odds over a particular thing. So,
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, this is an interesting question.
Okay.
Can I practice soul retrieval on myself, or is a shaman necessary?
Well, I always think one should go to the experts when they're doing something. I think it's really important to. You can't really learn soul retrieval from a book. You can't really learn these techniques overnight or by taking a workshop. And I know a lot of people offer these things in that context.
Yes.
But that's not necessarily how it works. My teachers wouldn't let me work on anybody for the first 10 years of my studies.
Really?
I was told that if you don't understand how energy works, how do you think you're going to work on somebody else? So a lot of my work and my study was actually for self-healing. I had to work on myself. So it was really,
And we come back then to the becoming.
Yes.
What I had asked you in the beginning.
Yeah.
It's learning techniques, but is that
right,
what you're saying?
Right, you're the healer. The healer has to heal themselves. And also all your experiences as a healer, and to understand suffering, you have to suffer. And I know that sounds really like some people go, why? But how can you have empathy if you don't know what that other person is feeling?
Yes.
How do you know what hunger feels like unless you've been hungry? So those are the things that really connect you. Because then when you see it, you go, it pulls your heart. And you say, I know what that feels like. Okay, I will do something.
And I recognize you in
right,
me.
Right, the whole,
Yes.
Yeah, Omani Padme Hum, bow to the
Yes.
lotus in someone else,
That really makes me wonder, like you were saying, people can go online and they'll have shamanic studies 101,
Mm-hmm.
and how do you know, and such a valid point that Adhi said, studying for 10 years before she could work on someone else.
Mm-hmm.
That's really important, Adhi. Thank you for sharing that. What is the most important quality required of a good shaman?
No expectations, really, because there's no control. Everything in the universe is chaos, unfolding into chaos, unfolding into chaos. So one of the things you have to learn is that you're not in control. Your job is to show up and then see what's happening, and then part of it is allowing, and then part of it is nudging, and part of it is just sort of letting things unfold, guiding things in certain directions. But you don't control it. You just you sort of nudge, yes. And the other quality is you have to have discipline. You have to study. You have to practice. I can't stress that enough. You have to be willing to show up and do the practice. You don't get better by playing the rattle. For me to play the rattle for hours took me a lot of practice. So I can sit in ceremony and I can play the rattle for hours. I can keep it at a consistent pace for hours because that's the sound that pulls people in and out of other dimensions. So when you can't play it in a regimented or a consistent way, you lose people.
Right.
Or people can't focus, etc. So discipline is really important.
And you were saying, so a big part of this is showing up. So where does intention come in as a healer? Where would intention come in?
It can't be my intention, because my intention is always because we're human, and all of us can't avoid this unless we have evolved in some way. But almost everything we encounter, we have some subjective opinion about. So even when my intentions are what I think are the best intentions, they might not be, depending upon my opinion about the subject.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it's always really important to not have expectations and not to try to intend anything, especially if it might be attached to something that I have emotional stuff about, or I might have an opinion about, or whatever. So to keep myself in as neutral a place as possible, and listen for the divine, because the divine is talking to us all the time. You know, it's like it's having a conversation, and we're not paying attention most of the time. But if we put aside the subconscious mind, we put aside the subjective mind, and we listen, that's truly what healers are supposed to do, is listen. Then we hear what the next thing is. We hear what the divine wants us to do.
Yes. Listening is so big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's so big.
Yeah.
Wow. This question asks, do shamans have to deal with bad spirits? And if so, how do they manage not to get pulled into the dark side?
That's a really good question. Well, partly it dovetails with like studying and not working on something for 10 years. Shamanism deals with dark and light. I'll just be real frank about it. But in order to understand the dark, you have to learn like how the dark does its stuff. And the dark is a very seductive thing because it implies power and ego. So you always have to, especially in your early training, have a mentor, somebody who kind of like keeps you on the path until you've dealt with all of your shadow stuff, so that you're not seduced by power. You're not seduced by that. But you can't undo the dark unless you know how it works. So it's kind of like I always say, it's like Star Wars. It's like Darth Vader was, you know, he was a good guy until the dark side seduced him. And that's what happens to a lot of shamans, is they see power in the dark arts or in the dark magic, and they get pulled into that.
And being aware of the ego.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're
people come to you, and maybe I would imagine people come, they're vulnerable, and the ego could.
Well, a good example of that is like, you know, when people come to a shaman or to any healer, they've had some trauma in their life that has shaken them to the core, and they question everything that's happening in their life, everything. And my job as a healer, or any healer that has integrity, is to make sure that person has a safe space to wrestle with their sense of reality. And there are plenty of healers out there with no integrity, and they'll take that person who's vulnerable, and they might be sexually inappropriate or emotionally inappropriate, or try to have power over them. And that's what differentiates that's also part of the shadow and the dark. So when you're training, that's all you're doing, is you're working on, like, destroying that, so that when someone comes to you, you're in service to them. It's like
and you put your ego aside, so you're just really in that centering
right.
place of just allowing.
Mm-hmm.
Because I imagine as a shaman, you yourself, you're always working on yourself. Right?
Absolutely. It never stops. I mean, you know, I have bucket loads of my own work,
right.
And I have a whole world full of, you know, job security.
Right. I can see. Oh, that's funny. Is there any parts of shamanism that is scary?
Yeah. Learning how to undo, not just undo, but like thought forms. People make up the most incredibly painful things and angry things. It's like, you know, they get angry about something or someone, and they hold on to it. They make basically their own sort of monsters, their own thought forms. forms, and dealing with those sometimes can be really tricky.
You mean in their head?
In their
They
head.
fabricated?
They're
or-
fabricated, but also when you fabricate something long enough, it does become reality.
Yes, I'm sure.
Yeah.
The power of thought.
Yeah, so dealing with people's thought forms is often really frightening. And sometimes if they've dealt with a thought form long enough, they actually become that thought form. So to extract the actual person from that is really challenging. And that can be really frightening because you have to take care of that vulnerable person inside that wants to come out. So that's often the hardest thing, the scariest thing.
I can imagine.
So, yeah.